chemical fertilizers. Chemical fertilizers was really important for them. Pesticides was really important, and so the industry that actually had a lot of priority was Taiwan Alkali Company. So to really kind of put what happened, of course, is that Taiwan Alkali at that point in time was making sort of like alkali or things that are used for soap and detergent from salt, table salt, sodium chloride, and that actually generated a lot of chlorine. But the other industries, the paper industry, hasn't caught up enough. So chlorine production was higher than chlorine consumption itself. But you couldn't really just kind of like dump this chlorine out into the air because it's poisonous. So what happened was they would blend the chlorine with limestone and turn it into calcium chloride and just kind of like chuck it out into the sea. This was actually very wasteful. And so the American advisors actually kind of suggested that why don't you, convert that chlorine into something which is quite usable, into a raw material for a certain plastic that was experiencing this really kind of exponential, that was actually experiencing exponential growth. And at the same time, another major ingredient for this plastic is acetylene, which you could actually make from calcium carbide, which was actually available in large quantities on Taiwan itself. And so initially, so this is the process itself, right? If we look at the process itself, calcium carbide that's readily available. This is something that's actually available. You have acetylene, you have chlorine, which is in excess, and you could actually make these things known as vinyl chloride monomers. And then there is this whole entire process that I will elaborate on a little bit later, where you have centrifuges to strip out the water, and then you go through a kind of a purification process to finally get you the PVC pellets. Now, Wang Yongqing, as I mentioned earlier on, had very little formal education. He dropped out of school, ran a rice shop, right? So he had no expertise whatsoever in the chemical industries. But he had a lot of money. So that was the thing. He had a lot of money. And he was trying to bid for a number of government projects, be it tires, cement, glass, and it all didn't work out. And so ultimately, what the bureaucrat who was in charge of this project, finally was convinced enough to allow Wang Yongqing to invest in the PVC business, along with Zhao Tingzhen, who's a nephew of a cabinet secretary. And then what happened, of course, was they also assigned two engineers who were working with the fertilizer companies to actually work together with Wang Yongqing. Interestingly, one person is called Shen Bingkang, who's published like 5 papers on the carbide method of PVC production. So again, interestingly, what we have here is there is a lot of crossover between fertilizer industries and the PVC industries, and of course, most importantly, the PVC industry existed to deal with a waste problem. It's a chlorine waste problem. Okay, so there's another issue. I think why I think PVC is a fantastic material to think about the Anthropocene, the Great Acceleration. PVC is a type of material. Remember, the adjectives I used earlier on is low cost, high volume, right? A low cost, high volume commercial polymer. Now, in order to achieve low cost, you actually have to increase the volume. You have to increase the production volume to drive down average cost. Now, the bureaucrats who oversaw or who facilitated the loans from the Americans were very cautious and they were worried about overproduction, and they believed that, PVC at this point in time was at best a kind of an import substitution project. And so it would be perfect if they would simply, build the world's smallest PVC factory. What was the capacity? Like 4 tons a day. Now, for comparison, the Japanese were making 100 tons a day. A big Japanese plant would make 100 tons a day. What this meant, of course, was that the PVC that was actually made during in the process was not just costly, but also there were a lot of problems, of course, with the quality. And even at these small amounts, like 4 tons a day, there were only 2 calendaring mills. These are mills that turn the PVC into like film. There were only 2 companies in the whole island that worked with this stuff. And so Formosa Plastics had to ship all these bags and bags of plastic molding powder into the warehouses of the government and put them as collateral for just to get money to just kind of keep the project going. In a way, what we see, of course, is this is what happens in the next phase. In the face of weak demand, Wang actually had to take a counterintuitive step. Now he had to ramp up daily output. This is the 2nd generation reactor tank, which was actually about 2 or 3 times larger than the first generation. It's not just increasing capacity. What they actually had to do also was that they also started to expand downstream. There was all this like PVC powder that's kind of sitting around. The government wasn't really interested in like acquiring all these excess inventory as collateral. And so what they eventually decided to do was that Wang Yongzai, the younger brother, exited the timber business, sold his timber business, used that money to buy these roller machines from Japan, and to actually make PVC film. Formosa Plastics also went further downstream. One thing they realized, of course, was that, well, if they made all this PVC leather, PVC film, they also made hula hoops. That was the thing. They made pipes, PVC pipes and hula hoops. But the market, there was a limit to what people were buying because there were very few people very few companies that were actually working with this material. What they decided to do was they went further downstream. It so happened that Wang Yongqing was visiting Japan and ran into a Korean War veteran, American called Jerry Carlin. And Carlin was running a PVC factory in Kobe, and then told Wang Yongqing that, he's got all these kind of problems. All the PVC products he was making was leaking. And Wang Yongqing actually helped him solve some of the problems and invited him to Taiwan to set up a tertiary processing plant. So what tertiary processing means, of course, is these products on the right-hand side of the slides, right? Things like bags, consumer products, raincoats. What happened, of course, was Formosa Plastics also extended its reach further downwards into tertiary processing. 1963 was also the time when they set up the Mingzhi University. University at the time was the Mingzhi Vocational School, Technical School, and began training their own staff. Now, what happened with the integration process? And these are some numbers that was in the earlier slide. What happened, of course, was that the strategy itself worked. The exponential growth, right? So you can see that it only took about 3 years for the output to triple. And then by 1971, the output of the company was about 100 times that when it started out. It's very considerable. This is actually a material that pretty much lends itself to scalability. Scalability is something that PVC manufacturers are always kind of looking out for. There's this desire to kind of increase its output. And what happens, of course, is that when the PVC pellets couldn't be sold on the international market, they would take this and sell it to plastic processors and turn them into products that would then be exported. So again, this is a case study that really allows us to understand how the great acceleration actually unfolds, right? Now, 1968 is another major turning point. This is where PVC manufacturing becomes much more interesting. Acetylene was, remember I was telling you that calcium carbide was the main source, was the main raw material that was used to generate acetylene. That process is about 3 times more expensive than what other petrochemical companies around the world were doing. The other petrochemical companies were directly using ethylene to get to acetylene. So this meant that the production cost was very high. And so what happened in 1968 was Taiwan finally built its first naphtha cracking unit. It made a considerable volume of ethylene. 2/3 of it went to an American plastic factory that was making polyethylene. 1/3 of it was being processed into vinyl chloride monomers. Why did they do that? It's because, remember I was telling you about Taiwan Alkali. Now, Taiwan Alkali at this point was now taken over by the China Petroleum Company, the state-owned petroleum company, and once again, they ran into the problem of excess chlorine. So what they did was they converted this excess chlorine, they reacted this excess chlorine with ethylene and turned it into ethyl dichloride, which would then become which will then be broken down into vinyl chloride monomers. Once again, what we again see this is that PVC again becomes, a way for the state to kind of deal with wasteful byproducts within its own. But this was a company that had serious mismanagement issues. By 1964, as I pointed out in the previous slide, the 10-year exclusionary period for Formosa Plastics ended. There were about 4 other companies that went into the space. The state also tried to centralize the supply of petrochemical raw materials. And again, this was a plant that never really met its production target. What happened as a result of this? Formosa Plastics decided that if it just stayed behind in Taiwan and relied on the government, on the state-owned petrochemical companies to provide raw materials, the company's expansion would be very, very limited. Taiwan's products, petrochemical products, will not be competitive. So what they decided to do, of course, was to actually just move on to the doorstep of their largest market, the United States. In 1972 and 73, actually, not a very good year, actually, if you think about the oil crisis. Formosa Plastics actually moved to Puerto Rico. They established a plant just outside Puerto Rico, on Puerto Rico, to take advantage of they had a supplier, an American supplier called PPG, that also had its operations in Puerto Rico. But the PPG plant in Puerto Rico was not working very well. And so by 1977, the Puerto Rican operations closed down. Formosa Plastics had to pull out, and they began to look towards the United States to buy up several PVC plants. One interesting company that I would like to look at particularly is this company called Stauffer Chemicals, based in New York, but they have operations in Wilmington, Delaware. And Formosa Plastics decided to largely replicate their strategy of buying up, and so this is where the map is kind of useful here, of buying ethylene from the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana, Texas. The price of the ethylene there was about 0.75 cents per pound, cheaper than elsewhere. This is a huge cost advantage, and then they would freight it over to Delaware. And from there, what happens, of course, is that the PVC molding pellets and the molding powder and pellets would be sold to companies that were making things like vinyl gloves, what were some of the common carpet liners, tiles, and what eventually happens is this: the United States itself, the operations, the Formosa Plastics operations in the United States became a blueprint for what it would eventually achieve in Taiwan. This whole, the petrochemical island that was going to be built was approved ultimately in 1991. Before that, around between 1984 and 1991, there were environmental activists who were protesting against all these plans, and Formosa Plastics actually had to abort its initial plans to situate it in northeastern Taiwan. It finally landed on this island, on this place off the coast of western Taiwan, in this place called Yunlin. In this place called Mailiao. And then there was no land there. They actually had to reclaim land. So this is actually a petrochemical island that was actually built. I have another chapter entirely about the environmental impact assessments and the environmental protests that I could talk about another time. But for now, I think I'd like to leave us, maybe, since we're talking about citing the Anthropocene, coming back to the theme itself. I'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of the technical imaginary of a circular economy that was built with plastics. Let me bring you back to Formosa Plastics Museum. I have 3 more slides. I'm almost done. The first thing that you see when you step into the Formosa Plastics Museum is a piece of wood, this magical wood. It's called the essence of the magical wood, 神木精髓, which, and I'll read the caption of it. It says it symbolizes Formosa Plastics' ability to pursue infinite possibilities and move ahead with the times with the spirit of sustainability. It's actually a perfect metaphor for the sort of like that captures the biological normativity of Formosa Plastics business operations. Trees secrete resin, right, when it's being attacked by, these wood-boring organisms. Formosa Plastics also makes resin. The company itself grew also on the ruins of Japanese colonial rule. It thrived despite being attacked from different sides. It thrived despite having to deal with bureaucratic hurdles and capital constraints. And one other thing which is really interesting is that there's a company mascot. There are these birds known as the emperor pheasant, the Mikado pheasant. It's a rare bird that's found in the mountains of Taiwan. Interestingly, it's also the bird that's on the largest bill on Taiwan, the 1,000 new Taiwan dollar bill. And it seems to kind of send a message that plastics is not just an integral part of Taiwan's industrial ecosystem, but plastics can coexist harmoniously with the natural environment. It also, I also had the chance to visit the other museum, the other Formosa Plastics Museum, which was built on the site of its first factory. And this is where I began to kind of realize that, wait, maybe this whole idea about the circular economy, or why petrochemical companies thought they were very natural candidates, or this was just part and parcel of what they were doing, is that the idea of closed-loop manufacturing systems was actually very similar to the idea of the circular economy, right? The recycle, reduce, reuse. Essentially, if you were to look at the way in which to describe manufacturing processes itself, the way that these manufacturing processes are being described is that there is an attempt by the company, by these, or rather they had to recover these unused monomers, recycle them, and make sure that these harmful substances did not kind of leak out to the environment. And this is also, as you can see on the other image on the right, which is Wang Yongqing's motto that pollution is actually a form of waste. Formosa Plastics as a company is very cost conscious, and actually one of the points that it keeps bringing up is that pollution control is part and parcel. It is actually in line with the company's business interest. The third image is the last image that I'm going to leave you with, which also kind of left me very puzzled after I stepped away from the Formosa Plastics Museum. This one is the one in northern Taiwan. It's a plastic replica of a forest. And perhaps I feel that, perhaps this is what a dream of sustainability that's built with plastics might really kind of look like. It is an artificial forest. It is an artificial replica, but, could it actually mean that it's actually devoid of life? And that's the thought I will leave you with. And look forward to questions, thoughts, comments, and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan. It was really a wonderful talk, a wonderful time listening to you. It has also helped us to dispel much of the myth that people usually have in this industry, this plastic production industry. Given the right technology, many things can be achieved. Yeah, fine. Yeah, thank you. It was a wonderful talk listening to you. It has helped to dispel much of the myth, at least one or two myths regarding the plastic production industry, that using the right type of technology, it is possible for plastics to, the last line that you said, to coexist harmoniously in the environment. I'll just point out the key points of Dr. Tan's talk before we open the space for questions and observations. Dr. Tan began with a short introduction to Formosa Plastics and how the farm has helped in developing the city of Taiwan and its surroundings. Then he spoke on the role of Formosa Plastics in the Taiwanese economy and the making of Taiwan's economic miracle, the process of fossil capitalism, and how Formosa Plastics has overcome resource constraints and its alliance with other farms and diversification in business, which is expansion and vertical integration. He also talked about the relationship between PVC and fertilizers, which of course is a very important aspect, and ended up with the idea that when waste is minimized, pollution is minimized, the companies grow financially strong, and the environment is not harmed. Thank you, Dr. Tan. Now I open this space for questions, observations, and comments. Any questions? Since there doesn't seem to be any question from the audience, and though I have some observations which I would probably share with you online and not bring it here, because that was one part which you said you won't be discussing here as it goes beyond. And I mean that Formosa American, that Louisiana project. So that thing, by the way, and just a minute. Is there any other thing? Or can you do the thing? Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Tan, for being here with us this morning in India. It was wonderful listening to you, and you have indeed enlightened us with how a plastic economy can also contribute to the making of dreams. The circular dream, rather than circular logic that I would say, it's circular dream that goes on developing. At the same time, linking it very well with the theme of the conference on the Anthropocene. Thank you, Dr. Tan, once again. It was a pleasure listening to you. I hope to listen to you much more in future. Thank you very much for giving us a valuable time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tan, for that fascinating exploration of industrial modernity and its contradictions. Our gratitude also to Dr. Hazem for chairing this session with so much of warmth, and also to come because you have comprehended the entire lecture. We will now move on to our academic sessions. So here, we end it here today. Thank you everybody for joining us on our day 2 of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, and maybe we can sign off now.
Hello. No. Hello. Check. Hello. Check. Hello. Check. Hello. Hello. Check. Hello. Check. Hello. Check. Now she's a 2 minute phone করেছে। হ্যাঁ কি পোস্ট দাঁড়া আমি দেখছি কি দেখছি দাঁড়া কি পোস্ট করেছি অফিশিয়াল পেজে। Hello.
Hello. Mic check.
এটা সবাই করছে, অনেকের আছে দেখছিলাম। অ্যাপোলজি আমাদের কে পোস্ট করেছে আমার কাছে আইডিয়া নেই।
Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to the second day of International Conference, citing Anthropocene, culture, politics, and literature. So today we'll be beginning with the technical sessions. We already had this fascinating plenary lecture. So for chairing this session, we have with us Professor Miyazi Hazem, and I would request Shraddha to read his bio note, and I'll also like to request our presenters to please come here and be seated. So we have here Jahira Hussain from Surendranath College, Shudipto Shaha from Surendranath College, Nandini Ghosh, Sister Nivedita University, Arnab Dash, IIT Madras. Presenters and chair, please be seated. Okay, sir. Over to you, sir.
Hello.
Is someone absent?
Yes, one presenter is absent. Arnab Dash, the last one. So we will wait 8 minutes, 8+2.
Before we begin, let me inform you about the time that is allotted. It's 8+2. Will there be any bell or a reminder? Just a reminder, like bell will be there. Okay. A bell or a reminder would be given to you as you present. Of course, as we have already seen, papers usually cannot be covered in 8 to 10 minutes. Therefore, I leave it up to your wisdom to make the best of the 8 minutes plus 2 minutes that is given to you. Well, may I now request Jahira Hussain from Surendranath College to make her presentation.
Hello. Very good morning to the respected chair, sir, and all other dignitaries and my dear colleagues and the present students, I guess. So, without saying anything else, I would just start with the paper. And as you can see, the title of the paper is The Anthropocene and the Indigenous Response, a reading of Mother Forest, the Unfinished Story of C.K. Janu. In the contemporary humanities, where the Anthropocene has emerged as a critical framework for understanding how human actions have become geological forces, the testimonial life narrative of the Adivasi leader C.K. Janu demands renewed attention. Mother Forest, the Unfinished Story of C.K. Janu, is not simply an autobiography of a tribal woman in Kerala. It is a cartography of loss and resistance that discloses how the Anthropocene is experienced at the level of the body, the household, and the community. Janu's text, as mediated through its translator and editor, recreates the political ecology of Wayanad, the northern highlands of Kerala, where deforestation, capitalist agriculture, and internal migration have reorganized both the landscape and the gender distribution of labor. When read through the intertwined lenses of ecofeminism and Anthropocene studies, Mother Forest articulates a vision of environmental justice that unites gender, ecology, and class within the lived texture of disposition. So now let us take a look at the historical ecology of Wayanad. Wayanad lies on the edge of the Western Ghats, a mountain chain recognized by UNESCO as a global biodiversity hotspot. Its steep slopes, dense canopy, and monsoon-fed valleys once sustained indigenous communities such as the Paniya, Adiya, Kuruma, and Kurichia, who practiced shifting cultivation, foraging, and small-scale paddy farming intimately tied to the forest's rhythm. Under colonial rule, These self-regulating economies were disrupted by the imposition of the Janmi system, which transformed customary land into taxable property and converted the Adivasis into bonded laborers. The British survey maps of the 19th century reimagined the region as a frontier for resource extraction, first timber, later plantations, and by the mid-20th century, large tracts of forests were classified as reserved under the state control, foreclosing indigenous access. The most decisive ecological and demographic transformation, however, occurred between the 1940s and 1980s. Just a second. When art became the target of massive in-migration from the overcrowded mainland and coastal districts of Kerala. Encouraged by state policies and Christian missions, thousands of settlers from Travancore and central Kerala moved into Venard, clearing forest land for paper, coffee, tea, and cardamom. These waves of settlers brought with them new crops, farming techniques, and market linkages, converting subsistence landscapes into cash crop economies. Deforestation accelerated soil erosion, altered rainfall patterns, and dried perennial streams. Meanwhile, tribal people who had cultivated these lands communally for generations were displaced to the margins, employed as casual laborers on the very estates that had snatched away their ancestral forests. Janu's own childhood in the 1960s and 70s unfolded in this transformed ecology where, and I quote this from C.K. Janu, forest and field had been taken over by others, and where, as she writes, our hearts were now at the very edge of the forest where even the wind was thin. So, yes, now as we can see, these are some of the quotations from the text I have quoted where, she talks about, okay, I think I have, yeah, where she talks about how through the migration, how the loss of forest resulted in the loss of ownership and alienation of the indigenous people. Right, so here we can see how she talks about how their people had turned into mere wage laborers. Mother Forest had turned into the departmental forest. It had barbed wire fences and guards. Our children had begun to be frightened of a forest that could no longer accommodate them. And I unquote. So, and when we look at how she looks and how her people looks at the forest as a mother that can sustain them, we see that the text, Mother Forest, entwines ecological belonging with feminine identity. And she writes, the forest was our mother. And she continues, she gave us everything we needed, roots, fruits, herbs, and honey. And when she was hurt, we felt pain in our bodies, unquote. This metaphor of the forest as mother is not a sentimental trope, but a political ontology. The forest is both a sustainer and a giver, and harm to it constitutes both ecological and corporeal violation. When later, Janu writes that Mother Forest had turned into the departmental forest, she condenses into a single line the entire logic of colonial and post-colonial enclosure, the conversion of a living kinship system into an administrative property. The transformation of the mother into a department epitomizes the Anthropocene's bureaucratic rationality, where the forest is no longer a relation but a resource, which is measurable and alienable. So the ecofeminist significance of this shift lies in how it recognizes gendered labor. As plantations expanded and subsistence agriculture declined, Adivasi women's daily routines of collecting firewood, fetching water, and cultivating small plots became increasingly precarious. So if we just look at the lens of ecofeminism, we see how the theorists like Karen G. Warren, Vandana Shiva, how they talk about the methods through which the exploitation of nature and animals is justified by feminizing them. The exploitation of women is justified by marginalizing them. So this double logic, which conflates the feminine within the natural and the natural with the feminine, provides the epistemological foundation of what Shiva terms as maldevelopment, which is a patriarchal model of progress that annihilates both biodiversity and cultural diversity. So, in Staying Alive, Women, Ecology and Development, Vandana Shiva writes that the recovery of the feminine principle is an intellectual and political challenge to maldevelopment. Her insistence that women's ecological knowledge represents an alternative rationality, cooperative, cyclical, and life-sustaining, offers an interpretive lens through which Janu's text becomes legible not merely as an autobiography, but also as ecofeminist praxis. Now, coming back to the migration history of Waynard, the migration history of Waynard renders Janu's ecofeminism distinctly local and historical. The settlers who arrived from Travancore in the 1950s and 1960s brought with them a market-oriented agrarian logic, alien to the Adivasi worldview. Yeah, I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes more if I'm allowed. So forests were cut into neat geometric fields, and tribal settlements were absorbed as labor colonies. Land reform legislation in the 1970s, though celebrated as progressive, largely benefited these migrant farmers, while the indigenous people lacking documentary titles were excluded from ownership. Now, the previous one, where she is talking about how large number of people were becoming landless and homeless, and because they did not have the documentation that was required of them in order to prove that they belonged to the land, they belonged to the forest. So, as men sought wage work in plantation in towns, women's responsibilities expanded to include both domestic labor and seasonal field work. So this feminization of agricultural toil coincided with environmental depletion. All right, and so just towards the end of the paper, I would just like to mention about how Janu's political evolution had resulted in collective action. The formation of the Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha in the late 1990s, her leadership of the 2001 Secretariat protest in Thiruvananthapuram, and the subsequent Muthanga land occupation of February 2003 transformed the intimate sufferings of the mother forest into organized resistance. The Muthanga struggle, in which 2 people died under police firing, dramatized the state's preference for conservation, tourism and plantation revenue over tribal sustenance. And Janu once again explains, we went to reclaim the land that was promised to us, but they said we were encroaching upon the forest. And I unquote with this. The struggle, I think, still continues to some extent. So, and I would just want to conclude the paper with this. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jahira Hussain. We shall take up the questions at the end for everyone. If there are questions, please be ready, and we shall put the questions together at the end. So I now request the second paper presenter, Sudipta Saha, to make his presentation.
Cross this side. Not that. It's fine, you can change the slides from there on. Good morning, all present here. I would be speaking on the topic from ground zero to 0R, rewriting trauma and temporality in the Anthropocene imagination of American fiction. The 21st century marks a profound reconfiguration of trauma, temporality, and narrative in American fiction. From the immediate shock of 9/11 to the slow-burning dread of ecological collapse, the literary imagination has increasingly grappled with a world where catastrophe no longer punctuates time but pervades it. This paper argues that the temporal logic of trauma forged in post-9/11 fiction re-emerges in climate narratives under the Anthropocene condition, transforming trauma from a singular national event into a distributed planetary experience. In dialogue with the trauma theories of Kathy Carruth and Dominic Lacapra, alongside Deepesh Chakraborty's Climate Historicism and Timothy Morton's Dark Ecology, this paper traces how American novelists such as Don DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy, Ben Lerner, and Jenny Offel inscribe the metamorphosis of trauma's ontology through fragmented temporal logics and formally experimental narrative strategies. Trauma theory, as articulated by Carruth and Lacapra, emphasizes the belatedness of the traumatic event, its resistance to immediate representation, and its recursive intrusion into the present. In post-9/11 fiction, this belatedness manifests as both narrative rupture and affective disorientation. Don DeLillo's Falling Man from 2007, for instance, dramatizes trauma as a disjunctive temporality. Characters move through the ruins of the present, haunted by the impossibility of return to a coherent before. The attack on the Twin Towers is both omnipresent and unreachable, an event endlessly deferred in its comprehension. However, when we turn to the Anthropocene, the structure of trauma undergoes a profound mutation. As Chakraborty suggests, the Anthropocene collapses the temporal divide between human history and geological time, making humanity both subject and agent of planetary trauma. Climate change, unlike the eventual shock of 9/11, unfolds as a slow violence that resists dramatization. It is not a singular wound, but a chronic condition, diffuse, anticipatory, and without closure. Fictional responses to this condition, such as Offel's Weather, published in 2020, or McCarthy's The Road, published in 2006, reveal an emergent aesthetics of attrition, a temporal flattening where the future is foreclosed and the present becomes a prolonged aftermath. Now, when I talk about the post-9/11 temporality, with the shock of the instant, and I would discuss it eventually in this paper if I have the amount of time left. In the wake of 9/11, American fiction grappled with representing the unpresentable, and even an event that seemed to shatter both narrative form and historical continuity. The collapse of the Twin Towers became emblematic of a symbolic collapse in meaning itself. DeLillo's Falling Man renders this through fragmented time, where memory and perception loop endlessly, refusing linearity. The protagonist's repeated reenactments of the falling body, both literal and metaphorical, inscribe trauma as an ongoing temporal oscillation between the moment of impact and the impossibility of assimilation. Ben Lerner's, just a second. After that. Next, keep it there. Ben Lerner's 1004, published in 2014, extends this temporal anxiety into a post-9/11 New York haunted by storms, blackouts, and premonitions of disaster. Here, trauma becomes anticipatory. The city exists in a state of suspended dread, waiting for catastrophe's reoccurrence. The traumatic temporality that once marked the after of 9/11 now defines the before of climate apocalypse. Lerner's metafictional style, his recursive self-reflection, and narrative self-dissolution mirrors this affective paralysis where the future is not a horizon of possibility but a repetition of loss. The Anthropocene introduces a radically different temporal order. If 9/11 compressed trauma into an instant of spectacle, climate catastrophe dilates it into an epoch of attrition. Timothy Morton's notion of dark ecology captures this shift, where the recognition that humans are entangled in ecological systems they cannot fully perceive, and that the distinction between human and non-human agency has dissolved. The Anthropocene is thus not an event, but an ambience, an ongoing trauma that structures existence itself. In The Road, McCarthy presents a landscape after the end, yet temporality persists as haunting repetition. The father and son's endless journey through ash and ruin is a meditation on time stripped of futurity. There is no clear origin of catastrophe, no event to recall, only an interminable present of survival. The trauma here is ontological rather than historical, diffused across species and matter. Similarly, Offell's Weather captures the cognitive and affective toll of climate awareness in the Anthropocene. Her fragmentary form mirrors the fragmentation of the self under the weight of environmental dread, where trauma becomes a mode of attention, a continuous low hum of anxiety that resists narrative closure. The movement from ground zero to 0R Next. The movement from ground zero to 0R marks a transition from localized national trauma to global planetary precarity. Post 9/11 fiction centers on the American subject grappling with loss, guilt, and disorientation. Yet, in the Anthropocene, the human subject itself becomes decentered. Trauma is no longer confined to human suffering, but extends to ecosystems, species, and geophysical systems. Chakraborty's concept of species being underscores this transformation, where humanity must now confront itself as a geological agent implicated in its own end. In literary terms, this reorientation demands a new narrative ethics. Climate fiction often displaces the human perspective, foregrounding the collective or non-human agencies. McCarthy's barren landscapes, Offell's fragmented consciousness, and even Delillo's late works gesture toward this dissolution of anthropocentrism. I'll just skip on to the conclusion and I'll take just 1 or 2 more minutes. The passage from ground zero to 0R marks not merely a historical trajectory, but a profound reconfiguration of temporality, ontology, and narrativity in the 21st century American imagination. Ground Zero names the site of modernity's implosion, where the spectacle of 9/11 exposed the fragility of the liberal humanist subject and inaugurated what Jean Baudrillard termed the vertigo of the real. 0R conversely gestures towards the Anthropocene's terminal temporality, a horizon in which apocalypse ceases to be evental and becomes atmospheric. If post-9/11 fiction narrativizes the trauma of the instant, Anthropocene fiction articulates the trauma of duration, the suffocating continuity of crisis that renders the very notion of quote-unquote after obsolete. In this movement, from geopolitical to geophysical trauma, from the singular wound to the distributed catastrophe, literature performs a radical epistemic labor. Thus, from ground zero to zero hour is not simply a metaphorical passage, but a metamorphosis of consciousness from the immediacy of the terrorist sublime to the diffuse melancholia of ecological extinction. The literature of this epoch renders visible the slow apocalypse of modernity's own making, situating trauma as both the symptom and syntax of the Anthropocene. In collapsing the temporal boundaries between past catastrophe and impending ruin, contemporary American fiction enacts a new chronopolitics where survival supplants progress, mourning supplants mastery, and the very narrative of the human is rewritten in the shadow of planetary bounds. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Sudipta Saha. That was a very interesting paper, but we shall take up observations later together. Now, may I request Ms. Nandini Ghosh to kindly make a presentation.
Good morning and my greetings to the respected chair and everybody present here. My paper is Unintentional Deliberation, Nurturing the Anthropocene, Art of Post-Independent Modernist Bengal. Actually, I'll be speaking about art objects, or rather paintings, visuals, which actually announce the coming of the Anthropocene. I will be having a number of slides, photographs, and visual paintings and things, and hoping that this will be speaking for me as I present the paper. So I begin with the next slide, please. Oh, Rumir, sorry. So how do I go? So I begin my paper. The rapid increase of human activity resulting from the Industrial Revolution of the mid-20th century is usually considered to be the key factor ushering in Anthropocene, the new geological epoch. The other factor that stands equally important is the long-lasting impact of World War II. Indications regarding the advent of the Anthropocene were apparent but went unnoticed in many of the expressions of visual art of the post-independent modernist Bengal. World War II had devastating impact on the geographical extent of Bengal, affecting adversely the socio-economic stratum and the political conditions of the region. Being a part of colonial India, it suffered the dire consequences of war, with the British wartime policies leading to Bengal famine of 1943, claiming near about 3 million lives, social disruption, communal riots, intensified nationalist movement, continually claiming lives in slaughter and bloodshed. Despite the looting and amassing of wealth and resources of the colony, the post-war circumstance had weakened the British governing system, whether they admitted it or otherwise, and colonial bondage was headed towards an end, though at the cost of a brutal partition. Uncountable Hindus crossed borders from East Pakistan, that is present Bangladesh, in a desperate quest for refuge. This resulted to severe anguish and destitution in the region as it affected its economic and political mechanism to the extent of destabilization. The subsequent decades had to suffer adverse consequences of such insolvency, leading to distraught, violence, bloodshed, and trauma. I'll be showing some pictures now. These are the glimpses of 1943 man-made famine in Bengal. These are the photographs that I collected. And following will be, now these are some of the art visuals that were created by the artists of the time in an act of photojournalism where they were documenting what is happening. Chitta Prasad Bhattacharya, the well-known artist, and later Somnath, who I'll be showing, they were actually documenting the situation. And for Janajuddho, the People's War, that was a communist newspaper that was published in Kolkata. So these are effects of the famine that we can see, the documentations. I'm sorry, it's going backward. I'm sorry. How to go back? Yeah. So this became almost like social realism. This is a picture of the Tebhaga movement, which was documented by Somnath Hor, the procession of people heading towards the Joddhars. The Joddhars are the, rich, the peasants from against whom they were actually activating. So. And then this was a picture painting by Gopal Ghosh, who has also documented famine in this kind of an expression. Now, the visual artists active during this period till the decade of the 1970s were not only witness to the pain, struggle, and trauma early in at some time of their life, but were forced to live with the same as if in destiny. One clarification, I'll be talking till the 70s because post-war or post-independent is a big time span. So I've selected only till 1970s because 70s was an important landmark, particularly in the development of modernist art. So that's the main reason why I talk about 70s. Okay. Now, images of darkness and human suffering that overhauled the age and became a constant feature of almost all artistic content that were critically spelled or sarcastically expressed in a constant engagement with a socio-political and helplessly inadvertent existential issue, an artist's concern with the art and the biosphere began phasing down. This paper proposes to address such images that pose strong political anthropocentric concerns, but with syndromes of withdrawal from everything else, including the natural sphere of existence, announcing the slow but sure advancement of the Anthropocene to take over. Some more pictures of the post-war and colonial Bengal. This is the communal violence in Calcutta. The imagery will show in what condition people were living, what the artists of the following days had actually suffered or experienced. And then these are imageries that were actually post-war and colonial of the colonial time. Gopal Ghosh's communal riot. And, once again, the communal riots in Kolkata, the violence there. And this is one picture by Chitta Prasad showing the political stand of the Communist Party for India. Okay. Now, what it meant to be post-colonial, the social conditions in the post-independent Bengal. It was hard for Bengal to overcome the shackles of the colonial bondage that had been a constant element of concern so long. Particularly the British policies of exploitation during the World War II had long-term effects on the region's economy and social conditions. It was yet to heal from the scars of it suffered from the man-made famine of 1943 and the subsequent communal riots of 1946 in Calcutta. Okay, I'll just try to short it down. The most pressing concern that threatened to destabilize West Bengal was the relocation of rehabilitation of the uprooted, disenfranchised mass from East Bengal. For a geographically small state like West Bengal, already confronted with the difficulties of economic slump, it was a task difficult to handle. The destitute influx not only took a toll on the state's economy, but it also affected the social, political, and cultural fabric of the region. Constant shortage of space for living, education, food, fuel, employment, needs and requirement for the betterment of living conditions led to non-stop upheavals and revolts from different sections of the society, making situations all the more difficult for a region that was already ruined by colonizers' policy and was yet to develop a strong administrative setup, faced politically motivated disruptions, dislocations, and violence. The following decades after independence suffered a non-stop array of unrest, revolutions, and protests. The ultra-left movement that started in 1967 in a small village of North Bengal and aimed at empowerment of the landless peasants and laborers through destruction of the owners of proprietary agriculture possessions and the rich farmers soon veered towards the urban centers with its violent moves of destruction, targeting everything that came under the jurisdiction of the institutions of the nation. Their violently destructive armed revolutionary move, in turn, was repressed ruthlessly by the governing system, killing almost, mass of young potential minds, and that crippled the future cultural growth of Bengal. Earlier to this, in 1966, Calcutta also experienced a second wave of communal violence, leading to slaughter and bloodshed, one more cause generating fear, discomfort, and dislocation. I will not try to show, I'll just touch on the fact that every time there was a war, yes, just a moment. There is a war, they have disrupted effects on the visual art also. It also happened during the time of First World War, when we come across movements like Cubism, Futurism, or Dadaism, where there we can see, severe dislocation of the human mind from the nature. So this also happened here. I don't know, I have already crossed the time, so I would just like to show the pictures once and finish my paper. So these are from the 70s, paintings by Jogen Chaudhary, where we can see a Ganapati here and a man who is, and there is a darkness in the background, and there's there's a kind of feel of loss. Then there is this Robin Mondol's paintings, which are also trying to throw light on the political situation of the time. Robin Mondol's paintings once again. Paintings by Shyamol Dattaray, the broken bowl particularly here, and disillusion, this particular picture. Sorry. Ganesh Pine's paintings. This is by Dharmanand Dasgupta. And little later, that same period was also, highlighted by Bikash Bhattacharya, though in 1982, but he was actually addressing the issues of the 1970s. Just two more words and I'll finish it. The images were more concerned with the social realism and the immediate. Though allegorical contents, satirical statements qualified them, they were rooted to their context. Elements of violence, mystery, doubtfulness were gaining prominence. Indigenous elements, consciousness about self, and above all, they spoke of an existential crisis. Disconnectedness with the ecosystem, that is nature, is observable everywhere. So with that, I'll make a very fast end to my paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It has been a wonderful paper, and as Andrew Marvell says in the poem to his co-mistress, had we but world enough and time, such lengthy discussions, I'm just changing that, wouldn't have been a crime. Let me now invite questions and observations before I go for my remarks on the papers. All the three papers have been very interesting, and I'm sure there should be questions. All right, if there are no questions, then I shall move on to my remarks. I shall begin with the first paper by Jahira Hussain, titled The Anthropocene and the Indigenous Response, a reading of Mother Forest, the unfinished story of C.K. Janu. In her paper, she has shown how a text, in the background of Wayanad, she has shown how a text can transcend its genre and take wider connotations. She has shown how deforestation and destruction of ecology have become prominent parts of development, and the critical lens that she uses are eco-criticism and ecofeminism. She has spoken extensively about demographic change and capitalization of resources from the 1940s to 1980s, and pointed out how legislation went against the native settlers and government's quantification of resources. And she ended with the idea and giving us the fact that the problems with tribals' ownership of land has been there and is still continuing. The second paper by Sudipta Saha was titled From Ground Zero to Zero Hour, Rewriting Trauma and Temporality in the Anthropocene Imagination of American Fiction. Sudipta Saha has begun the paper by configuring trauma, okay, with analysis of American authors in the post 9/11 event and how they represent trauma in narrative ruptures, the technical aspect of trauma, how climate change is shown as slow violence in contrast to the type of violence that was in the 9/11 act, the aesthetics of temporal flattening, bringing about a question or issue on time, which leads to the grappling with the unpalatable in American fiction. The themes that the novels which Mr. Shah has taken up, they try to grapple with the unpalatable in American fiction. He also spoke about collective response to trauma, where a sense of overall apprehension exists. Something is going to happen. That sense remains there. The concept of dark ecology that finally decentralizes as trauma shifts its focus from individuals to the entire ecology. He ended by referring to a very interesting concept of chronopolitics in New American fiction. The third paper was very different and therefore very interesting visually. Now, taking us away from the text, the written word, to the world of art, Nandini Ghosh brought us or gave us a fine taste of Anthropocene in arts, the shifting socio-historical context influencing art in post-independence Bengal. The time period which she has chosen is from post-war to 1970s, where she has shown how the gradual shift in the historical and socio-historical context has influenced artistic production. She also spoke and showed us glimpses of how British imperial policy and the partition of Bengal, partition affected Bengal and its population. Referring to political Anthropocene, she has shown and talked about problem of resettlement and economic burden in Bengal, finally ending with mobility towards urban centers. Thank you so much. All the three papers were very, very interesting. Had we more time, then I'm sure the last paper and all three papers, especially the last paper, ma'am, we could have gone on discussion. So wonderful presentation. Thank you, everyone, the paper presenters and the listeners.
Thank you, presenters. I would like to request Topu sir to please come here, Professor Dr. Topu Biswas, to come here and felicitate Miyazi Hazem sir. Volunteers, please assist him. Thank you so much. So after these intriguing sets of papers that brought together indigenous voices, post-colonial ecologies, and reimaginings of Anthropocene in both Indian and global contexts, now we would have a short tea break, and after that we will have plenary lecture by Professor Dr. Anona Dattagupta. Thank you.
From Kolani, and this is sir. I have done the job. And that is Sange, he's from ISM Dhanbad. That is NC sir, that is Topu sir, that is Ananda ma'am from Kolani Vishwavarati. You won't remember any of our names. That's okay. I'll remember the faces.
Resistance will be there. The names are not easy to remember it only. That is true. And when so many people are introduced.
That is true.
I'm honored. আমি তো এখানে kind of honorary member of the department মনে হচ্ছে। We would like to request our presenters. No. Not at all. Couldn't be. Well, I seem to have joined them. Oh, that makes you a good Samaritan. I didn't quite, I wasn't being ironic, but I can see that you decide to pick that possible strand or strain. When were you at Vishwabharati? Last. You were.
That's the year 2020.
Did you visit
Get
the
a PhD
department?
Viva. And the candidates are off. They were no, Shakti.
Then we should do something to make sure that you.
And the Gazette of India, Bengal Gazette and Education.
I would like to request the presenters to please come on stage because your certificates will be distributed right now. May I request Assistant Professor Devdatta Mitro to come here on stage and distribute the certificates to our presenters. So first up we have Jahira Hussain from Surendranath College. Thank you, ma'am. Next we have Shudipto Shaha from Surendranath College as well as Sister Nivedita University. May I request Nandini Ghosh of Sister Nivedita University to please come. Thank you. So, we are having a tea break right now, so please. Sorry, I'm so sorry. So may I request Professor Dr. Miazi Hazam to please come here and collect your certificate. So finally we can go for a tea break now.
So be it.
So people sound such an inefficient
Thank you.
people sound such an inefficient ওরা বলে যে আপনি আপনার এরকম গন্ডগোল করে সব কাজ বুঝতে দেওয়া So সেই জন্য ওরা বলেছে যে না আপনি বেশ গুছিয়ে আপনি Presidency is very, very good. We are extremely happy. We are very, very happy. হ্যাঁ কিন্তু মুশকিলটা হচ্ছে যে মানে উনি যতই ডাইনামিক হোক না কেন স্টেট গভর্নমেন্ট যদি চায় যে ওনাকে কাজ করতে দেবেন তাহলে তো কিছু করার থাকে না কেননা মানে উনি প্রচণ্ড খেটে হাতে পয়েন্ট রস্টার করেছেন উনি জানেন এক্স্যাক্টলি কোন Yes. Until I open my mouth. And then I start to say something completely different. So, মানে উনি প্রচন্ড চেষ্টা করছেন উনি হাতে পয়েন্ট রস্টার তৈরি করেছেন উনি ভ্যাকেন্সিজ লিস্ট দিয়েছেন কোন ডিপার্টমেন্ট রিজার্ভেশন হ্যাপেন সব কিছু স্টেট গভর্নমেন্ট চেপে দিয়েছে ভীষণ ভালো কিন্তু ওনাকে স্টেট গভর্নমেন্ট কাজ করতে হবে they won't allow him to do it.
যেতে পারলাম না, ভেবেছিলাম যাবো, রেজিস্টার করবো।
Things that every year we shall continue this tradition, number one. Second, every year we shall have an total university alumni meet. Every year we shall have one mega seminar of the university where all the departments will be together, including at least 9 or 10 colleges. এটা ভালো কথা।
What will be the seminar on?
That you may constitute a committee, very simple. And maybe next week, কাজ করে দেখলাম তো ওনার সঙ্গে, he is also working very hard, thinking very hard, and planning very systematically. Of course, 10 works or 10 decisions
History exactly. Generally having a good time. Sometimes in the classroom, mostly outside. He's very much into quizzing and has had quite a few podium finishes, which was quite a, I don't know, discovery for us because he hadn't had much chance to. The interesting blood speaks because Shudev had been a very keen quizzer. I don't know, so how it kind of how that kind of ended up becoming his abiding interest since, shall we say, he moved to Kolkata. I have no clue, but that seems to be the case. ও আমার মায়ের কাছে থাকে at Golf Green, but we have a place at Patuli now. So whenever I'm here, he moves in with me for the weekend. And so he's kind of between places.
So you're having some problem with the metro, no? Because the metro
Yes.
doesn't go all the way to Patuli anymore.
Yes,
So that is a problem.
that is a problem.
So what does he do for transport?
When he is at Patuli? Do you mean about commuting to Jadavpur and back? Or he takes the orange line, which is headed in the other direction, so which is not really adversely affected by the suspension of metro services on the, what is that, on the blue line, yes. Because it's the blue line terminus, but it's also the orange line kind of.
So he takes the orange line and he goes
to Jadavpur, to what's that? I'm not very good with the names. It's the one on the connector, Jadavpur connector, bypass connector, whatever is that. It might Jyotirendra Gandhi or some such, or Kobi Shukanto, or I think it's Kobi Shukanto. And then he takes an auto to Jadavpur Thana and walks it.
See, that's a good thing. But the good thing is that the orange line is working.
Yes, at least. But I think footfall is pretty sparse because until and unless the entire route is in service, it doesn't really do anything. So you want a joyride, you can do it. It is, yes, but maybe not as frequent as, let's say, the blue line tends to be, so not, or the green line. I don't know about the green line, blue line, because I did take the metro to Kolkata.
I was told that apparently there's a meeting going on and
স্যারের সাথে কালকে আলাপ করা হয়নি, সরি।
কালকে সবাই ব্যস্ত ছিল।
নো ইচ আদার, বাট অফিসিয়ালি আলাপ হয়নি।
Time, don't you think so? have another writing pad that I can
Actually, I was told that I would have to say when to speak, and I was trying to cut it short, and I made a mess of it. But it's very nice. Encouragement.
to see you in person, as in
outside the school.
outside the school and not virtually.
So we are also very glad that Sally is all right and he's back in the work.
Yes. I'm so sorry to hear not
Yeah, I fell down. I hurt my spine. So I was out of action, completely bedridden, flat on bed for 2 months.
hope you're fully recovered now.
I am recovering. I haven't recovered.
Very painful.
And I couldn't feel. I couldn't do anything. At the 15th of you, I asked one in the day, one at night. So they used to say, hey, need. Have you introduced you?
Hello. বেশ খানিকক্ষণ যে তোর বাড়িতে গেছে তোদের ছাত্র অভিজ্ঞ রেভিং অ্যাবাউট ইউ ভালো তো हमारा एग्जैक्टली থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ এইটা বোধহয় অনলাইন আমার অনলাইন কোথায় যাই অনলাইন আমরা কি করে যাই অনলাইনে জীবনে অলওয়েজ খুব সুন্দর লাগছে আর তুমি দিয়েছিলে না আই থিঙ্ক সো দাদা নিজে দিয়ে বলে তুমি দিয়ে যাও আচ্ছা নো যাকে আমি আসছি এই প্রপোজাল আরে এই দেখো আপনি কত নেবে গল্প শুনে হ্যাঁ
Okay, so we are back again, and caffeine time is officially over. So let's refill our minds with some more ideas. So now we have our plenary 4, which will be delivered by Professor Dr. Anonna Dattagupta, who will speak on precarity and the Anthropocene, reading Shakespeare alongside Amitav Ghosh. Professor Dattagupta's scholarship, known for its depth and interdisciplinarity, bridges early modern drama and contemporary climate fiction, an apt juxtaposition for our times. Anonna Dattagupta, Professor of English, has taught at Bishwabharati for over 2 decades. She secured an MPhil degree in early modern English literature as a postgraduate Felix Scholar at Oxford University in 2001. She successfully completed her doctoral work on the early modern representation of war in 2014 under the supervision of Shukanta Choudhury, now Professor Emeritus, Jadavpur University. Her revised Orient Black Swan annotated edition of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, Book 1, 2012, continues to be in worldwide circulation, and she has several other scholarly articles, essays, and book reviews published in national and international journals to her credit. She was Charles Wallace India Trust Visiting Fellow at the Center for Research in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Cambridge in 2015. Besides numerous invited lectures within the state, she has presented several academic papers in the past 2 years, notably at the World Shakespeare Congress, Singapore 2021, the Oxford University ERC-TIDE Conference 2021, and the Asian Shakespeare Association 2022 and 2024. She is one of the seminal leaders of the World Shakespeare Congress to be held in Verona in summer 2026. Among her many recent publications, the one that might interest the participants at this conference is one on Amitav Ghosh's archipelagic thinking titled No Man is an Island, Climate Change and the Challenge to Insularity in Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island may be found in Critical Imprints, Journal of the Department of English, Loreto College, Volume 10, Landscape and Memory, 2023. This session will be chaired by Professor Dr. Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee is Professor, Department of English, University of Kolkata, West Bengal. His doctoral work was on the novelist Christopher Isherwood, a recipient of Fulbright Scholarship, for which he went to University of Texas at Austin, and the British Council Charles Wallace Fellowship, University of Cambridge. Professor Chatterjee has co-edited The Muffled Heart, Stories of Disempowered Male, contributed to the American Isherwood, University of Minnesota Press, 2015, Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and the Isherwood Century, and Reader's Companion to 20th Century Writers. He has published in journal American Notes and Queries, Taylor and Francis, and Intersections, and has reviewed for Gay and Lesbian Review worldwide. He was also a member of the editorial board of aforementioned ANQ. In March 2011, he served as visiting faculty at the Department of English, University of North Bengal. He has been teaching a course in gender studies at his university since 2009. With Tutun Mukherjee, he co-edited Nari Bhab, Androgyny and Female Impersonation in India. He has translated the fiction of Krishna Gopal Mollik entitled Entering the Maze, Queer Fiction of Krishna Gopal Mollik, and is a recipient of Rainbow Award for Literature and Journalism 2023. I would request Professor Dr. Shubir Kumar Dhar to felicitate Anonna ma'am. Sir and ma'am, if you could come forward. Volunteers, please assist them. Now, may I request Professor Dr. Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee to please come up on the stage. You can start. I would request Eskeri sir to please felicitate him. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, ma'am.
I believe it's still forenoon. So a very good morning. Such an honor to be here. Such an uncommon honor to have been felicitated by Professor Shubhit Dhar, and of course to be delivering this talk in the presence of Professor Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee. Lovely to meet him after, I believe, many decades. Again, particular honor. I am hoping that I have all of the 40 minutes that I was promised. It's not with too little trepidation that I offer my submission today. It was very hurriedly prepared, but nonetheless, I'm so grateful to this department for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with this learned audience. I'm reading this paper less than a week after Hurricane Melissa devastated lives, livelihoods, infrastructure, and the economy in Jamaica. Closer home, it is also about a month since a flash flood, quite unprecedented, caused irreparable damage to Kolkata's book hub at College Street. Close upon the heels of this year's angry and obstinate monsoon comes a report published in the Telegraph, Kolkata, only yesterday, according to which India recorded the steepest rise in greenhouse emissions in 23-24. Thus, Bill Gates's assurance notwithstanding, our sense of fragility and precarity is far from assuaged. I happened to be reading Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, 1946, when the call from DESNU came, Dr. Priyanka Chakraborty, and it set me thinking, the call and the invitation, about the peculiar paradox of reading this narrative essay in times when questions of precarity and survival are as loud as a church gong. The human exceptionalism underlying Frankl's message may appear to be the affirmative, converse face of precisely the anthropocentrism that Amitav Ghosh rues in The Great Derangement. However, this is my submission, this chilling record of Auschwitz is a white paper on survival, individual or collective, in which reality can only be met with resilience. I've been a climate dilettante since the beginning of this third millennium and owe this in no small measure to the good offices of Amitav Ghosh's books, my acquaintance with which dates back to receiving a copy of In an Antique Land as a parting gift from Jogomaya Devi College after a 6-month stint of teaching there. That was back in 2002. The question that has lately exercised me, therefore, have been suitably doused in the skepticism and ambivalence of a dilettante. What to read and how to write responsibly in this age of heightened precarity? Let us remember the fundamental nature of this question for those of us who call reading and writing their calling. It is no less fundamental than the guilt one feels when taking a hot shower or letting the faucet run in the wash basin while one is ruminating and brushing teeth at the same time. How is that, me saving water or not doing so, going to be of any use to a woman walking miles and miles for a vessel of drinking water in one of the African countries? That's a thought that often, as it were, fills me with anxiety. Viktor Frankl has proved peculiarly apposite to this overwhelming question. Given that humanity is solely to blame for precipitating this crisis, given that each one of us is implicated in ways small and large in the original sins of the Anthropocene, is it still exceptionalist to talk about human survival, planetary survival, and human responsibility towards that survival or self-preservation? What can we do but be human? Perhaps with the all-important E at the end? The inescapability of being human, once born human, makes it imperative never to unremember the singularity of this predicament. In this sense, we are all Agamben's homo sacer, at once privileged and damned, at once sacred and sacrificial. Homo sacer, which Agamben locates at what he calls the threshold, is a position and state of precarity. And in this duality of knowing that we are both culprit and perhaps one hopes, deliverer, lies our ambiguous, diffident way forward. I was flattered to find yesterday, in course of, may I request somebody to, I didn't realize I had, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to, is there I'm so sorry about this. The next slide, is it going forward?
This one is forward, this one is back.
I think we are past, this is, yes, thank you so much, yes, we could stay with it.
This one is back.
Thank you. So yes, not much by way of a PPT, excuse that drawback to the what is now a regular visual component to any presentation. I can only plead, shall we say, a lack of or paucity of time, but that's not a good enough excuse. So if you're interested in the Agamben, shall we say, observations or shall we say pronouncements, here they are on the screen for you. Now I move on to another thinker. I was flattered to find yesterday in course of my preparations for this talk that I was unknowingly echoing Judith Butler's articulations in the first essay of what she calls the book, The Precarious Life, 2004. And the essay is titled Explanation and Exoneration, or What We Can Hear. The quotation is up there for you. I'd like to summarize it in the following words. Butler argues that we are implicated and innocent at the same time, and our responsibility for our actions, in turn, is ours despite having been acted upon. The context, of course, for Butler's essay is 9/11 and America's response to that terror attack. But as we often see in discussions around the Anthropocene. And curiously, that applies to the Shakespearean text that I'll be talking about. There's a chiastic interchangeability between war and the kind of climate crisis that we have both engendered and are subject to. Let me return, therefore, to the question, what does one read and how does one write in the Anthropocene? In terms of personal intellectual imperatives, the challenge of becoming human with an E also entails merging, welding, alternatively setting off fissions and fusions between disparate chunks and lumps of reading interests. Excuse my mixed metaphor. In this case, Shakespeare and Ghosh. On first glance, intersections between them might appear to be ideologically incongruent. Does not Ghosh indict the Dutch in the early 17th century, the time, shall we say, remember, of Vermeer, for celebrating, or even Rembrandt, a little later, I believe, for celebrating a renaissance of the visual arts precisely when some of them, greedy for nutmeg, were massacring the inhabitants of the Banda Islands? Should our collective outrage at the bane of prolonged colonial subjection, the yet unfinished project of decolonization, and the related crisis of environmental degradation here in India make us hostile to reading Shakespeare, so proudly projected by Dr. Johnson as Britain's abiding cultural export? Is not reading Shakespeare tainted with what Ghosh calls, quote, the emancipatory motives of humanist thought? One wonders, though, whether the muddle and the mess of history allows us choices that are quite so categorical and sanitized. Unfortunately, our grudging need for Shakespeare might be attributed to his knowing representation of just such entanglements. The question is perhaps, again I'd like to submit, not whether we should read Shakespeare at all anymore. The question is how we read him and whom we read him alongside. And to set the record straight, Amitav Ghosh in The Gun Island has himself already invoked Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice and added to it interestingly revisionist trajectories in the traffic of people, goods, and ideas during the early modern period. Those of you among, perhaps there are students who have read The Enchantress of Florence, might consider, shall we say, a comparativist reading of these two. In a convergence that Ghosh was far from oblivious to when he was writing The Gun Island, which is the idea of islandness, for want of a better coinage, the fact of being an island in the Renaissance English psyche is marked by comparable tension and ambivalence. And these two states of being, as it were, are, shall we say, already embedded in the concept of precarity. I was looking up precarity as a term online, and I found that there could be two possible connotations. One is, of course, of being caught between choices, and the other, of course, is peril or danger. So caught between choices which are not easy is, of course, perhaps the cause of the second connotation, which is the danger or the peril. So there's a duality in precarity as a term itself. And I'm trying to explore that in the island, in the concept of the island itself, in the ontology of an island. Sir Thomas More's Utopia is an early Renaissance text cultivating a certain critical equidistance from both the bane and the boon, of the ongoing Reformation. King Henry VIII had also, metaphorically speaking, effected a surgical excision of England from the continent, and Sir Thomas More, with an equivocality of perspective quintessential to the Renaissance Christian humanist, is able to see the ramifications of this delinking in the grey rather than in black and white. So England, thanks to the Reformation, is more of an island than in strictly geographical terms. Towards the end of the century and the end of Elizabeth's reign, England self-fashioning as a nation-state with a political stance separate from that of mainland nations, must have been consolidated enough to create a different kind of unease. At the turn of 16th century, England would come to feel more insular than it ever had in its past. The ambivalence in John of Gaunt's speech in King Richard II is hard to miss. So it's deeply adulatory, but of course, that phrase has kind of acquired an iconic status, this sceptred isle. But towards the end, of course, he betrays his misgivings, his apprehensions about what England has done to itself. So being an island is also somewhere about a subject populations, or shall we say, grappling with the ambiguity of its socio-political realities. So islandness is fraught with anxiety. Right. So, sorry, I probably lost. Yeah. To move on then, I'm just kind of preparing the stage for what should be an opening, as it were, premise for me, as far as King Lear is concerned, which is that King Lear is emphatically an island play. Being an island is a very, very powerful trope at the heart of the crisis in King Lear. And that is perhaps where I'm drawing connections with Amitav Ghosh, with, shall we say, the particularities of the Anthropocene crises. As you know, Jamaica is also an island. At the turn of the, archipelago of islands, forgive me. At the turn of the 17th century, a deepened anxiety will prompt another early modern contemporary of Shakespeare's, John Donne, to profess, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." And that comes in Meditations, the source, which is the source of the epigraph in the, right? And this is John Donne's rousing assertion, I'd like to interpret, of his entanglement with all men as a primary, inalienable condition of existence. All this, sorry about that sentence, I've kind of lost the plot somewhere. All this may be said to culminate in the island as a contested and contentious space, particularly in Shakespeare's Tempest, which Ghosh, Amitav Ghosh, interestingly cites in his correspondence on race and empire with Dipesh Chakraborty. I do not know, and that's part of the conversations published in his latest book of essays, fascinating collection, Wild Fictions. Most of my quotes from Ghosh would be from that book. I have already worked, or shall we say, engaged with some of his earlier, shall we say, works on climate change, so I thought I'd restrict myself to Wild Fictions. So that's where the conversation with Dipesh Chakraborty figures. I do not know whether Amitav Ghosh was remembering Donne's words when he wrote the essay Cyclone Nargis for the New York Times, 10th May 2008. These governments have to first acknowledge a basic and ever more evident truth of the human condition, which is that in dealing with nature's fury, no nation is an island. Quite uncanny. This is where national pride gets in the way, for this acknowledgement entails a humility that does not come easily. King Lear is Shakespeare's most apocalyptic work in spirit, and in many ways presages the apocalyptic cast of 17th century prose writing. This is most evident in Lear's imprecations of planetary apocalypse, such as when he says, "And thou, all-shaking thunder, strike flat the thick rotundity of the earth, crack nature's molds, all Germans spill at once." No wonder then that the ardent editor R.A. Folks should note the kinship with absurdist theatre in the aftermath of the Second World War. Significantly, Folks also notes in his introduction the rise in the popularity of King Lear as a play on stage since the Second World War. I shall not read the quote, it's up there for you. The psychosis around the fragility of the self could well have been a culmination of over a century of early modernity, a discovery of the bleaker side to what Burckhardt calls the discovery of man and the natural world. And let us not forget, according to Ghosh in The Nutmeg's Curse, that is exactly when the Anthropocene took off. King Lear is a text in island apocalypse and island paranoia, such as will resonate with the world's island consciousness today. Islandness, shall we say, is both a geophysical condition and a state of consciousness of precarity that both ensues from and exceeds the former fact. An island is already divided, severed, orphaned. This paper proposes that the entanglement of political lives and the physical environment that Shakespeare represents in King Lear seems to prefigure the complex precarities of our planetary existence today. Amitav Ghosh identifies Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans in 2005, much like Melissa has done very recently in Jamaica. And he uses the phrase catastrophic convergence. And he goes on to elaborate on that, saying it was a collision between a climatic event and social and historical factors like crumbling infrastructure, poverty, patterns of terraforming, governmental neglect, and structural racism, unquote. Do I have it there? May not. Here, Ghosh recalls the spiral and fractal combination of disintegrations at the heart of the tragedy in King Lear. The breakdown in the play is not just political, and I'm sure everyone here, no one here needs to be reminded of the plot and how it kind of hurtles towards that catastrophic finality. It is social, familial, linguistic, and psychological. And all of it is both reflected and precipitated by the physical storm. As in Ghosh's contention above, the awareness of precarity takes a more compassionate and political turn in Lear when he's ruing the plight of the poor in his land. What are his words? "How shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these?" Act 3, Scene 4, lines 30 to 33. In these lines, Lear and his author acknowledge Amitav Ghosh's disclaimer for calling the Anthropocene, that too in its late stages, quote, "a time of monsters." Right, that's from Ghosh. King Lear is a play on precarity and as one of dividedness and on dividedness. Indeed, the very dividedness that precarity ensues from. It thus presents to me a very apt allegory for the world today. Precarious and fractious and therefore even more precarious. Just when we would have thought we should have been thinking collective survival, we are diverting ourselves with wars in the plural. Perhaps the wizened of the world know that war has always, cynically speaking, decided who survives, which civilization lives to tell its tale. As the ABBA song goes, forgive me for going popular here, the winner takes it all. More than about wars that distract from the war of survival, it may well be said that the corruptness of King Lear's mind and subsequently family and kingdom is a trope through which we can view the war of perception on climate change, even the war of perception. Ghosh alerts us to the fundamental conflict of perspectives derailing consensus between the global north and the global south. We wouldn't have the time to allow me to read through that, but you have it there. As Shakespeare notes in King Lear, in an economy of excess, extravagance, and prodigality, not only human beings, but all human being and becoming, even language, betrays the precarity of falling and fallenness. So that it's not just an apocalyptic play, it's decidedly a post-lapsarian play. Regan will complain of her father. No marvel then, though he were ill-affected. This they have put him on the old man's death, to have the expense and waste of his revenues. So those were the other operative words. In a crassly transactional rhetoric of gamble, again presaging perhaps Timon of Athens, I think it's a remarkable play, so invite students to explore it. Lear baits Cordelia with the lottery of words. What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Act 1, Scene 1, 85 to 86. So the play King Lear reeks of Shakespeare's alarmed consternation at the fin de siècle-like decadence, a feudal family being at the heart of it, and a society and a state concentrically crumbling like a pack of cards in the face of the extreme demands made upon all kinds of resources: love, loyalty, language, not just money or land. How extraordinary that Amitav Ghosh should rue in very similar terms the conjunction of climate change and migration. According to him, in The Great Uprooting, it's a long title. If you want details, I could quickly step off and bring my copy back to the days, but I'll hold that for later. According to him, the convergence of the humanitarian crisis and the planetary crisis, quote, both are effects of the ever-increasing growth and acceleration of processes of production, consumption, and circulation, unquote. This was published in the Massachusetts Review and has been republished in Wild Fictions. The larger implications of, now I move to the implications of what I have been methodologically attempting here, reading Ghosh and Shakespeare's King Lear side by side. So what are the implications? The larger implications for literature in the Anthropocene are profound and vital. Curiously, these ramifications take us back to the conflictedness felt by Viktor Frankl and also Theodor Adorno after the Second World War. You can see Frankl's quotation up there. Suffice it to say, this is about that, extraordinarily evocative moment when he's listening to a piece of sad, sorrowful music and remembering that his wife is somewhere in the same camp, but utterly, irrevocably inaccessible to him. And of course, he's going to lose his first wife, if I'm not mistaken. His wife will not survive Auschwitz. Notably, Frankl pays a tribute to the extraordinary ability in music to encompass the essence of tragic experience. And yet, for us, at two removes from his experience, the temptation might well be to sublimate suffering, and this can cause, in turn, moral discomfiture. Perhaps I'm assuming too much, but it certainly does to me. I'm not the one who's suffering. So isn't it a luxury to be experiencing tragedy at second hand, as it were? And in this case, this is not even King Lear. It's something that actually happened and continues to happen to this day. War and suffering. Adorno's essay, called Cultural Criticism and Society, is far more provocative than what is contained in his concluding statement, and what did he say there? The famous words, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." The collection is called Prisms. Adorno implicates the cultural critic earlier in the essay for sublimating precisely what I was talking about, and hence perhaps ending up diluting the experience of suffering. Judith Butler also talks about this extraordinary, shall we say, problem around mourning and suffering in this world. Unsettlingly enough, ethically as it were, some people seem to deserve to be mourned more than others. So there's a politics to tragedy globally, which he so eloquently talks about. So here I am addressing a seminar, feeling deeply privileged to be doing so, but would I really, God forbid, of course I'm not exactly in a particularly suicidal frame of mind at the moment, so I wouldn't wish it upon myself, but I cannot not acknowledge the fact that I did not suffer. I happened to be traveling on the day when that deluge happened, but I did not suffer. I had to, I had a personal vehicle which magically enough ferried me to Howrah station. I could catch the train and take my classes at Bishwabharati. I'm not in the same position as the booksellers who have also lost their sizable part of their livelihood, their stock of books, which was, as it were, their livelihood. So I am also sublimating, and I am also liable to the charges, the provocative, as it were, critique that Adorno wages. Sorry, I've moved on. So that's a long list of quotes from Adorno's essay, which you might kind of glance through. Interestingly, I move on from there, and I'm sure she had Adorno in mind. In the eponymous essay, Precarious Life, I'm just 3 pages short, or no, 2 pages from the end. In the eponymous essay, Precarious Life, in the book called The Precarious Life, Judith Butler not only invokes the phrase cultural criticism, perhaps remembering Adorno, but comes up with a brief for the humanities not altogether different from the challenge thrown by Adorno. So there it is for you. I would like you to pay particular attention to the last sentence. It's a sense of the public in which oppositional voices are not feared, degraded, or dismissed, but valued for the instigation to a sensate democracy they occasionally perform. And earlier on, and it's tied up with the idea of precarity, and I guess she may have been this may have fed into the title that she chose for this essay, locating, therefore, humanities at the, shall we say, the limits of the human capacity to make sense. Remember King Lear and how it also talks about the crisis of language, the crisis of expression, the crisis of meaning-making. Not that Amitav Ghosh does not task the humanities in the face of heightened precarity with creating the space for keeping dissent and critique alive. So yes, he would be very much, as it were, in agreement with Butler and his kind of provocative stance on, let's say, in The Great Derangement would be very much also, at least in spirit, in sync with the way in which, as it were, Adorno indicts facile cultural criticism or literature practices, whatever. However, I think Ghosh is doing something else. In the essay that lends its collection of essays it's titled Wild Fiction, it's originally written in 2008, Ghosh clarifies for us why literature, particularly fiction, can play an earthier role. And when I say fiction, I'm not making any stylistic distinction here. I doubt whether he would have been doing so either with drama. So that's still fiction. While natural history can redress some of science's indifference to the human element, literature alone, according to Ghosh, has the power to manifest, to imagine and envision a world which is whole again. So, art of living specialists often kind of ask us to manifest good things. So I think Ghosh is projecting something very similar for literature. Literature has the remarkable ability to manifest a better future. Excuse me. This vision, which literature is able to manifest, is not unlike the lesson, that Ghosh has for literature, is not unlike the lessons that King Lear's ending leaves us with. Indeed, even before the ending, Lear's own short-lived fantasy of simple life in the company of Cordelia, to whose nursery, as it were, I just happened to, this struck me this morning that nursery is also a term that we use for a place that we go and procure saplings from. So it is from the overlap with a place where children are tended to and plants are tended to etymologically, or shall we say lexically. I think it's a fascinating intersection to explore. So indeed, even before the ending, as I said, he talks about retiring to Cordelia's nursery. And that is not too far from the healing hand of nature that Ghosh thinks literature alone has the resources to translate and disseminate meaningfully. And that's the whole quote for you. That's what I've been talking about, but of course we are in no position to, shall we say, read through it line by line. Incidentally, he does mention other literary texts, but not Shakespeare. So, my final paragraph. Ghosh goes on to conclude the essay, Wild Fictions, saying, in India, we are fortunate that in our literary traditions, powerfully influenced though they are by the West, have never wholly succumbed to the romantic imagining of nature as a pristine, uninhabited temple, unquote. I would like to demur with this somewhat reductive, polemical kind of branding of Western English, particularly English literature, as being invariably, as it were, romantic in its representation of nature. I'd like to demur saying that King Lear is unsettlingly unromantic in its representation of nature. And that is where its relevance as a play in the study of precarity might be said to hinge. Thus, for Ghosh, unlike for Adorno, the political question is not whether literature has any value in times of precarity, rather, what kinds of literature. Perhaps, and that is my closing submission, Shakespeare may also be read alongside the storytelling traditions Ghosh upholds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Gupta. Would you want to sit over here while I make my comments? This was, I'll probably just go up there. This was a very self-critical talk, and it did not make for comfortable listening, and I don't think you meant it that way. It is meant to trouble us. It is meant to make us very uncomfortable. And I think what Professor Dattagupta makes very, very clear is that we somehow seem to have perfected a kind of studied hypocrisy, in the sense that we have found a way to talk about the environment without doing anything about the environment. And we've become so fluent in that hypocrisy that it doesn't even matter to us anymore. So we could be sort of using expensive means of transport, but at the same time we could be very worried about, global warming and greenhouse effect, but at the same time we're not going to make any changes to our lifestyle at all. And I think that hypocrisy is something that I think Dr. Dattagupta absolutely sort of points out to us. I was reminded of various other things while listening to Dr. Dattagupta, and especially when you talk about, what it means to read him alongside. And I was actually thinking about this critic who I myself find incredibly useful. She is a Vietnamese critic called Trinh Thị Minh Ha. And Trinh Thị Minh Ha talks about, and which I think is a really productive idea, speaking nearby. And I love it because it's so moving, because, every time because very often you come to this discussion where who gets to speak for whom? What right have I got to talk about? And then she said, if we are going to go down that rabbit hole, then we will only be reduced to talking about ourselves. But surely that's not what the humanities and literature is about. So she says that instead of getting wrapped up in these polemics about empathy, sympathy, because it tends to be so contentious, can we talk about speaking nearby? So therefore, I am not speaking for you, I am not speaking against you, I am speaking beside you, I'm standing nearby. And I think that is a wonderful critical position to take as well, because when you're speaking nearby, you are not making any pretenses of being empathetic or being sympathetic. You're simply saying, I can't be empathetic, I can't be sympathetic, but I can speak nearby. And I thought that is something which Professor Dattagupta's paper makes abundantly clear, because I think she was also trying to speak nearby. Also, because I'm a gender studies person, so obviously how can I not, make any comments about your paper without mentioning the P word? So I think patriarchy plays a very important role in the way in which we regard nature, because of course the way in which we function as a society, patriarchy is so implicit. And it is also implicit in the way, I'm particularly struck by the fact that you talk about, the meaning of the word nursery and its double valence. Because, of course, the way in which we regard children is the way in which we regard women, is the way in which we regard nature. There is almost like an identical way in which they are constantly commodified, objectified. Children should be seen, not heard. Women should be seen, not heard. Nature should be seen, not heard. It's identical. And I think that is something which also becomes very, very clear, especially in that sort of absolutely very, very troubling speech by John of Gaunt. Thank you so much for bringing that speech back to my notice, because we used to have Richard II in class 11 and 12. It was a text. And I remember, can you imagine me being very moved by that speech and thinking, oh, how marvelous it is. And now, at the age of 59, when I'm looking at it, I'm shocked by it. And I'm particularly shocked by the way in which John of Gaunt is absolutely advocating imperialism. He's advocating colonialism. He says, we used to be conquerors once upon a time, now we've conquered ourselves, as if self-conquest is such a bad thing. Also, what struck me was the way in which I think COVID taught us very interesting lessons, in the sense that I'm sure many of us remember that when the entire world went into lockdown, nature renewed itself. There was the air cleared, we were breathing better, dolphins were appearing in Venice. So nature showed us what could happen if human beings just killed itself. And I have very often, I posted recently on WhatsApp status update, and I said, I love the government of India. And I love the government of Delhi, because the government of India and the government of Delhi are doing something exemplary. They are showing us that the best way in which you can care for the environment is by killing yourself. So just commit mass suicide by breathing in all the pollution, and all the problems will be solved at one go. So I am also struck by the way in which, stuff that Aristotle wrote about is something that keeps constantly invoked, and yet we somehow don't seem to be taking much notice of it. Aristotle also talks about the duty of literature, in which he says literature shouldn't, he's arguing against Plato, and he says literature is not about what is, but also what could be. And that is the same line that seems to be coming back to haunt us. So with those remarks, I would want everybody to please give a warm round of applause to Professor Dr. Gupta for what I think was a very, very troubling presentation, and thank you so much for it.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Gupta, for that insightful presentation of how we can make the classical and the modern converse considering Anthropocene. So we will start off with the next plenary session in another 5 minutes. Up next, we have Plenary 5 by Dr. Sange Tamang, who will speak on rethinking anthropoi in the anthropogenic climate change debate, reflections from the Indian Himalayas. Sange Tamang is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Dhanbad. His research area broadly fall within the area of environmental sociology, developmental studies, Himalayan studies, and climate change. His work has appeared in the journals like Sociological Bulletin, Ethnicities, Economic and Political Weekly, Indian Anthropologist, European Bulletin of Himalayan Research, etc. This session will be chaired by Dr. Jigme Yeshi Lama. Jigme Yeshi Lama is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, University of Calcutta. In 2018, he was awarded a PhD from the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His thesis explored the modes of garnering legitimacy by the Chinese state in Tibet and the challenges faced by this project. He has published articles and chapters in books and journals, and also attended several international and national conferences and seminars. His research interest lies in the state-society interactions in the Himalayas, with a focus on the role of Tibet and Tibetans. May I request Professor Dr. Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee to please come up on the stage to felicitate Dr. Sange Tamang. Sir, could you have? Now may I request Dr. Jigme Yeshilama to please come on stage, and may I request Dr. Priyanka Chakraborty to felicitate him. Sir, please. Could you please come? May I request our volunteers to please assist Priyanka ma'am. Thank you, everyone. Now I hand it over to the chair to begin the session.
Yeah, okay, right. Thank you. All right, so let me start by thanking Dr. Priyanka for inviting me to this important conference on Anthropocenes. And I'm sure that we already have, or you already have a lot of discussions on the idea of the Anthropocenes. So, and it was wonderful to hear you, Professor Datta, and thank you for such insightful lectures. So my lectures, I think, will be very different for all of you because I am not from the literature backgrounds. I'm from the sociological backgrounds, and the kind of the questions that I'm planning to ask in this presentation is very, very specific and very general, specific to the region as well as to the disciplines. But nevertheless, I'm also trying to ask some epistemological questions about the idea of the Anthropocenes. But there is very little components of, or let's say there is very little literature components on my lecture. So I apologize for that. Okay, so so the title which I am proposing for this talk is something like rethinking anthropoi in the anthropogenic climate change debates. So it's like rethinking the whole ideas of the human in the debates of the Anthropocenes. So there are some reasons why I brought this Himalayan perspective here, and there are a couple of reasons. The first is obviously the Priyanka has asked me to talk something on the Himalayas. And apart from that, there are two major reasons why I try to bring the Himalayas in my lectures. The first reason is that if you look at the history of the Himalayas, the amount of the human presence in the Himalayas today is at the highest level than ever before. Right? So there is a need to rethink the presence of the human in the Himalayas. But how do we rethink that? And second question is, or the second reasons why I choose the Himalayas is basically because of its ecological fragility of the regions, which is already at stake, given the amount of the disaster that is happening in different parts of the Himalayas, right? So we have witnessed countless disasters in the last 1 or 2 years only, and the recent being the disasters in the Darjeeling Himalayas, right? So with this note, I would like to provide some of my insights on rethinking the idea of the Anthropocenes in the Himalayas by connecting it to the larger epistemological and disciplinary questions of what do we mean by the Anthropocenes and the climate change, right? So I would like to read out my paper because I think that is the most easiest way to put our thoughts, right? So if you don't understand anything at some point of time, please feel free to stop me. So I have divided my presentation in 3 parts, right? The first part is about the Anthropocenes as a conceptual problems. The second part is about the Anthropocene as a historical idea and the political category. And the third part is about the Anthropocenes in the social science. So I would like to go by this structures. So let me first begin with this propositions of Anthropocenes as a conceptual problems. Okay, the term Anthropocenes has become a highly contested concept in recent decades as the crisis of climate change begins to loom as a major crisis in human history. After the geologist Paul Crutzen described the term Anthropocenes as a new geological era shaped by the deep interventions into nature by human as a biological and geological agent. So it placed human as a central agent in the debates of the climate change. As we all know that the Dipesh Chakraborty's beautifully argued that to call all human beings geological agent is to scale up our imaginations of the human, right? So this Anthropocene thesis construct human as a collective categories or universal human agent who is responsible for this planetary transformations. So my question is, are all human anthropogenic? Right? So I asked this question here to find some answers to understand what do we mean by anthropoi in the anthropogenic climate change debate. So scholars attempting to conceptualize this term Anthropocene have conveniently agreed that the Holocene is one of the most stable climatic or geological era in the human history. Right? It is during that era or during Holocenes where the entire history of agriculture and human civilizations took place, right? But however, Paul Crutzen in his analysis of the term Anthropocenes placed the onset of the fossil fuels energy regime, which begins in the late 18th century as the beginning of the Anthropocenes era. So 2 of the most effective fossil fuels that have changed the history of the human energy consumptions are the coal and the oil. So by the 19th centuries, these 2 fossil fuels had become the world's primary source of energy, outstripping the biomass, right? So we have all studies in our elementary science that almost all energy on this earth comes from the sun, right? So plants on average manage to capture less than only 1% of the energy delivered by the sun to produce their food through the process called the photosynthesis. So the inventions of the fire somewhere around probably 1.5 million ago and the discovery of the agriculture completely changed the nature of our energy consumptions. However, the energy regime during that time remains largely organic. So if you look at the seminal book titles The Great Acceleration and Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945, so this book meticulously captures the human history of the energy consumptions. So basically what I'm trying to argue here is that we have come a long way to define what is the Anthropocene in human history. It is not yesterday or today that Anthropocene has started or is starting. So it has come a long way. However, the manner in which humans are placed as a universal agent responsible for altering the planet's geological and ecological system actually invites a serious criticism of its conceptual, political, and ethical dimensions. So in the political dimensions, we have a rich debate on why all the nations of the world should not be categorized equally in terms of the carbon emissions, right? So many of us know these debates. So many Indian scientists, scholars, and very lately even policymakers started using this term environmental colonialism as a term first used by the Anil Agarwal and Suniti Narayan, right? In their very famous report, Global Warming in an Unequal World. However, the conceptual and ethical dimensions remain unexplored. Therefore, we need to raise this question that not all humans have contributed equally to the climate change, right? And by going this logic, if we are to examine the Himalayan cases or region that have that is suffering the most from the anthropogenic climate change, let's say from Uttarakhand in the west to Sikkim in the east, from Arunachal to Kashmir, we can list numerous instances of destruction in its ecological, culture, and human habitations. So what happens if we pack everything under the umbrella terms of the Anthropocenes and simply ignore it in the name of the climate change, right? So I don't have a simple answer to these questions, but I can argue here that it is very dangerous to use the term Anthropocenes without contextualizing it in its regional context, keeping in consideration its ethical, political, as well as historical context. Therefore, these presentations try to bring the Himalayan case to understand why Himalayan history needs a different integrations to understand the history of the Anthropocene. Okay, so the history of the Himalayas or the Himalayas themselves have always remained outside of the mainstream academic discussion. It is relegated to a space used primarily for leisure, science, expedition, spirituality, and the contemporary hashtags called the mountains are calling. Perhaps the colonial writings treat the Himalayas as something called the terra incognita or the unknown lands with no human. Even in the contemporary debates on climate change, the Himalayas, although they have become an important sites of inquiry, are mostly concerned with the melting of the glacier that pose a threat to downstream areas and remain completely ignorant of the human history of the Himalayas. Therefore, it is necessary to clearly highlight the diverse relationship that different kind of people have with the land. The relationship with the land is fundamental in shaping the idea of the Anthropocenes, because the land is identity and land is culture. This attachment to land, expressed through various cultural, spiritual, emotional, and social connections, remain the core of maintaining human relationship with the environment. So we have discussed this in details in one of our research titled The Indigenous Religion in the Eastern Himalayas. So what is important here to understand is that one cannot simply label all categories of human activities as anthropogenic. And from a Himalayan perspective, it can be said that the local communities contribute very minimally to the global emissions, but face most of the, severe climatic impact in their life, in their everyday life. Therefore, the term humans of the Anthropocene must be rethought through a lens of plurality, scale, and situated experiences. Okay. So this now leads me to the second propositions on rethinking Anthropocene as historical ideas and political categories, right? This is a very well debated topics. So this section actually highlights some of the questions that has already been raised by the Dipesh Chakrabarty in his articles, titles The Climate of History, 4th thesis, right? So this section highlighted these contradictions between the human history and the natural history as proposed by the Dipesh Chakraborty. So Dipesh Chakraborty argued that humans have become geological agent very recently in human history, only after the industrial revolutions and picked up in the second half of the 20th centuries. Henceforth, the distinctions between the natural and the human history started collapsing, right? So we need to agree that the Anthropocene is a historical concept, but at the same time, it is also a political category that requires extensive inquiry both from historical and political perspective. So the question that one need to ask is, do we really need a completely distinct historical discourse to put climate change and Anthropocene at the center of our subject matter? Perhaps this can be a major concern for many historians, many sociologists, or many academicians who view climate change as a planetary crisis of our contemporary time. Again, Dipesh Chakraborty suggested that we need to think of human as a form of life and look at human history as part of the history of life on this planet. But if we apply this logic to examine the history of human as a species in the regional context like the Himalayas, we can observe the distinctive patterns in human history and the evolutions of the geological force. So if you randomly type in Google or any of the AI app, let's say ChatGPT, and ask about the history of the Himalayas, so you get a very typical interesting response, right? So I'm first quoting the responses from the Google. So I quote here the Google AI version response. I quote here, the history of the Himalayas is primarily one of geological formation beginning about 50 million years ago when the Indian tectonic plates collided with the Eurasian plate, right? And the ChatGPT version goes this way. The Himalayas, the world's youngest and highest mountain range, have a fascinating geological history that spans tens of millions of years. So what is the problem in this kind of history? In both this case, the history of the Himalayas is a result of the geological formations, which began much later than any other part of the planets. But what is wrong there? My argument is that the way the Himalayas are viewed purely as geological forces overlook the humanistic history of the Himalayas or the regions, right? And if you analyze any of the major work on the climate change in the Himalayas that has been already published or that has been going on, you can find that most of the discussions on the Himalayas or high altitude regions were dominated by the science or statistical based model studies, which are highly augmented by the scientific narratives of the melting Himalayas. So this treat the region as a mere scientific laboratory to test climate-based data or number and model well suited to conceptualize the climate as a lifeless entity, completely separated from the humans, their emotional, cultural, and the spiritual world. Furthermore, this kind of statistical-based climate study became more effective when the IPCC described the Himalayas as a white spot with little or no data. And this significantly contributed to the creation of a more scientific knowledge on the climate change in the Himalayas by rejecting or sidelining human voices or other characteristics of the Himalayan life. So nonetheless, the recent literature has started departing from this, what I call as hyper-scientific epistemology of the climate change, and began to view Himalayas as a much more diverse and complex ecological as well as cultural landscape that stand not just as a water tower of the South Asia, but as a critical site for the entire planets. So at this juncture, it is essential for us to acknowledge that if we are to consider Anthropocene as a historical concept, we must also consider the plurality and diversity of the historical thoughts, even within the regional context. Therefore, the suppressions of the human history over the geological history of the place will only enhance the dominance of the single epistemology over multiple realities. Therefore, the Himalayas are very important to us today in the debates of the climate change. But the Himalayas without human will only valorize the old colonial imaginations of the Himalayas as, again, a terra incognita or the unknown land. So it is high time that we recognize the existence of the local communities as a significant part of the Himalayas, alongside the narratives of the scientific meltings of the glaciers also. Therefore, science without humanity is destruction, and the Anthropocenes without its anthropoi is a mere reflection of the colonial hegemony of the idea, as expressed in the case of the Himalayan context here. This now leads me to another categories of treating the term Anthropocene as a political categories in the Himalayas. So this stem actually from my own lived experience as well as a decade of my ethnographic research, particularly in the Eastern Himalayas. So this again direct me to the same questions of who anthropoi or who is anthropoi in the anthropogenic debates or Anthropocene debate. So notwithstanding this long traditions of treating the Himalayas as a geological formation, the history of the human have always been a subject of the political significance. The state-making project in the Himalayas, the cross-border mobility, the fluid lifestyle characterized by the shifting cultivation have always been an important markers of the Himalayan history. But they have remained outside the purview of the environmental debates. So to say that the environmental debates in the Himalayas is always an elite project. And even today it is an elite project, reserved exclusively for the scientific community. So this has been true even since the formations of the colonial science, in which the Himalayas serve as a living laboratory to test the new scientific theories. Perhaps most of the major scientific discoveries and natural sciences theory actually developed in the Himalayas. With credit goes to colonial administrator and botanists like the Joseph Dalton Hookers, who produce an extensive volumes on the floras and floras of the Himalayas, but there is very little mentions about the humans in the Himalayas. So why was the local community always excluded from the scientific debate? Was or is science too elite for the common people to be part of it? And this is a very important question that I ask here. Can Anthropocene be a science of the poor? If it can be a science of the poor, how can we conceptualize the idea of the Anthropocenes? So I'm quite hesitant to say yes here, because we lack a comprehensive analysis of the concept at first glance, as well as its regional variation on the other side. It is indeed not surprising to say that there is no single comprehensive volume on the environmental history of the Himalayas. So whatever the voices or whatever the very sources from which we are drawing our knowledge about the environment, climate and natural world actually originate from the colonial archive, right, which has been heavily manipulated by the political interest as well as the scientific discourse. Therefore, my propositions would be that the term Anthropocene should encompass, I quote, inequalities and justice as its two pillars, alongside many other concepts related to the everyday social realities. So this now leads me to my last propositions on the Anthropocenes as a conceptual breakthrough. So I title these propositions as Anthropocenes in the social science, how far we have reached. So how many of you would agree if I say that the discovery of the Anthropocene has created a new ways of investigating disciplines of the humanities and social science? It is indeed true that the climate crisis or climate change crisis has called on academicians to rise above their disciplinary prejudices, but the questions remain, can we do so? What will be our methodologies, what will be our theoretical construct, and what will be our conceptual framework to understand this planetary crisis, which has a completely different histories as proposed by many historians like Dipesh Chakrabarty? I don't have a clear answer to this, and this talk is not intended to provide answers here. However, let's take the moment to look back and see where we are today. So it was in 1972 that for the first time we openly discussed and talk about the environmental crisis at the first International Environmental Summit held in Stockholm, Sweden, right? The UN Conference led to the creations of many important organizations and bodies like the United Nations Environmental Programs. However, climate change during that, till that time, was just a footnote. We were not using this concept of the climate change or the idea of the climate change. The issues was viewed largely as a scientific concern and not a pressing political problems. On the other front, we witnessed the birth of many environmental-based movements such as the Chipko movement that called for attentions toward the environmental crisis. So it soon became a concern for many disciplines to study the environmental crisis from their own disciplinary perspective, particularly after the 1970s. And if you look at the trend, environmental history is one of them. Sociologists mostly conceptualize these categories under the brackets of something called the new social movement. The decades following the 1970s, particularly the 1980s and 1990s, witnessed a significant turning points for the social sciences in India. We all know this, right? The rise of the subaltern groups, subaltern studies actually opens up a new terrain of inquiry in the social science alongside many other events and phenomena worldwide. Like we have seen the advent of globalizations, new economic policies, many marginal voices and studies like the indigenous, gender, caste, and so on. So how can we locate the debates of the climate change here? Do we have any conceptual breakthrough to locate the concept of the climate change here? So at the global level, the issues of the climate change started gaining attention following the discovery of the ozone hole in 1986, which lead to the formations of many important organizations called the Montreal Protocols and the establishment of the IPCC. So again, the 1990s saw a significant increase in global attention to the use of the term climate change through many organizations like the Rio Earth Summits in 1992, the Kyoto Protocols in 1997, and numerous other initiatives. So the decades, only in the decades, in decades of 2000s that we started witnessing an exponential interest or increase among social science scholars to incorporate the issues of the climate change into their research and teaching. So today, many department, institutions, and universities offer courses on climate change, but there are still very few courses that focus on climate change from a multidisciplinary perspective. So can Anthropocene open this discussion? Right, so with this, this leads me to the last part of my lectures on conclusions, but I deliberately avoid preparing the conclusions because I don't have the conclusions. Okay, but when I was reading one article a few days back, it actually opens my mind to rethink again on the issues of the Anthropocene. So I quote this articles. So this is from the first line of the articles, which is titled as, is Anthropocene a dead concept? So in early March 2024, an experts panel of the International Commissions on Stratigraphy had voted to settle a question that has troubled geologists for years. So are we living in the Anthropocene, the human age? Right, so in early March 2024, there was a vote among the experts to settle whether we are really in the Anthropocene or not. The result of the vote was a clear negative, which means that in the realms of the geological disciplines, the debate that endured for the decade is now basically over. So is the Anthropocene debate over, or is the beginning? So the questions is still open to every one of us. We need to ask whether we really have, taken Anthropocene seriously in our disciplines or not, right? So I, from a personal point, I feel like there is a lot more to think about Anthropocenes as ideas, as a categories, as a realities. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
I will try to keep it as brief as possible. Thank you, Dr. Sange, for the comprehensive presentation. It was really great, and also, I guess what is needed in presentations or in papers is a sense of provocation, which even ma'am had even earlier provided, as pointed out by the previous chair. So you leave a lot of questions, right? In this, it was really interesting to listen to this presentation, and in this, I guess this is a more of an emic perspective, including from my side also, because I also belong to from the same place. So the local perspective also becomes highly important, which I guess Sir had earlier pointed out, that whole discussion. So through your presentation, you were able to, in one sense, shatter certain conceptions, certain ideas which are present with regard to climate change, especially in terms of the Himalayas, right? And the importance that you give, especially to this plurality and the diversity of the voices which are required, which are present and which are not really given the space in academia or in policy making, that I guess becomes important. Because at the end, with regard to the Himalayas, it is the Himalayan people who suffers. They are the ones to suffer the most. But also what I feel is that the Himalayan people also, they are equally responsible for bringing about the destruction of the environment, of the ecology, as we see in our own hometown in Darjeeling, where you have so many of these hotels been built and homestays coming up, right, mushrooming like anything, and they are mostly owned by the locals. There's also a kind of a moral responsibility from the side of the tourists, so that also needs to be taken into consideration. But as a student of political science, I strongly believe that the idea of ecology as well as climate change in the Himalayas has been somewhat blurred because of this deep sense of securitization, whether it is all the way from Kashmir till Arunachal, right? So more or less, this is one of the most militarized borders in the world, and that has actually somewhat dampened this whole idea of climate change affecting the Himalayas. It would have been actually great if to hear more about the indigenous religion part that you were mentioning, because this is something that has also interested me. And in this, if I just point out this thing, earlier, maybe around like 20, 30 years back, the anthropoi, the human, was seen to be in the context of the Himalayas, at least in Darjeeling or in the eastern Himalayas. They used to, in one sense, cohabit with certain natural spirits, whether it is the serpent, the Nag Devta, and so on and so forth. What I've noticed is that right now, there's no mention of the Nag Devta. So in that way also, how the anthropoi is actually becoming more stronger, how it is in one sense conquered nature. Maybe we are all following what the great Chinese, the founder of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao, said, conquer nature, move mountains. So that is something that is being followed, especially in the Himalayas. And finally, it was really interesting to bring up that you brought about this disconnect that was there between scientific, the knowledge, as well as the locals. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Sange Tamang, for the brilliant lecture. And also I would like to thank the university for inviting both of us. Now the floor is open for some questions, if there are a few questions, discussions. So maybe we can have, it's 30 minutes right now, so maybe for 10 minutes more. Okay, so they can question for both the panels, the previous one as well as for this one. So I would encourage students who are sitting quietly at the back, if they have some questions. Yes. Please keep your questions brief if it's possible so that we can take more questions.
I had a question regarding indigenous population. So this year marks 50 years of Sikkim joining India, as well as we can talk of the Tibetan government in exile. So what is your view of the Anthropocene and how can it relate because of the shifting political concerns that is?
Maybe we can take a few more questions, if that's okay. Yeah, if there are any more questions. Any more questions from the students or from anyone else? Okay, yeah, I guess the question is for Dr. Tamang.
Okay, well, thank you for these questions. My attempt today was to, just to open up the field to think whether there is a possibilities of rethinking this whole ideas of Anthropocenes, by placing it in the context of the regional cases like the Himalayas, right? So I haven't gone into deeper analysis to understand whether it is really a workable thesis or not. But then again, there is a possibilities to rethink, because the whole idea of the Anthropocene that is coming from the West is again sort of a, hegemonic ideas, which I feel it's completely ignoring or becoming elite projects, same like the colonial project. So in that context, I think there is a need for all of us to rethink the idea of the Anthropocenes from our own regional as well as situated experience-based context. So maybe that will be helpful to understand our Himalayan case much better.
Yes, sure. Sir.
Actually, what I wanted to ask, you have given partial answer to it. The same thing that you said about the indigenous people also being responsible towards the changes that is happening, especially in states, because I have been working in Arunachal Pradesh since 2008, and I have seen the rampant change that is being brought about. And because others cannot buy land, you cannot invest there without the help of the local. It is definitely the people there who are responsible for destroying nature. I'm using this word destroying very perfectly, because I am witness to, not me, thousands are witness to what is happening. Even the sacrosanct places, so far the rituals, like you said, probably rather than indigenous people not doing that, I think the indigenous ritualistic practices can help to preserve nature, because everywhere it's a power play now. And we know that corruption is everywhere. Greed is everywhere. So anyway, thank you for bringing up that answer. The last thing is just an observation that I want to add. You were referring to the 2004 subcommittee of AWG where this voting took place, and the president and the vice president both refrained from voting. The reason is that that was a geologist conference. The reason is that geologists are accustomed to working with large periods of time. Therefore, to look at Anthropocene like it goes like 70, 80 years, when this debate started, is equal to the average lifespan of a common man, of a healthy man. Therefore, they did not want to take that. But whether we agree to the term or not, the meaning that is there, that human agency is there, is very true. It has been there. And regarding the dates, some say it is the most accepted one is the acceleration, the great acceleration. But we can stretch it back so that we can we can pinpoint where the responsibility lies, who are responsible for that. No, because you have already mentioned, you have already read that. I'm sure you can understand the political and the imperial. Either they lay the entire blame on the white, male, north type, or they completely erase them out of all responsibility. So we need a middle path where we can bring that colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial, decolonial debate, everything here. So that's all. It was an interesting paper.
There's a hand at the back. Okay, yes. Can be questions also to the previous panel, as ma'am is already here. So please ask questions to the previous panel.
So, because there's a lot of discussion about how the indigenous people are also participating in the impact, the ecological impact, the negative ecological impact, the first thing it made me think about was where do we lay the blame? But then also, because oppressor and oppressed can be a continuum, the exploited and the exploiter can also be a continuum. Who used to be exploited, the indigenous and their resources, are now also part of the capitalistic system, right? Where it's either you survive or you don't. But then again, as sir pointed out, it's the idea where you're trying to pinpoint blame. But then how do you sort of come out of it without like blaming, or how do you come out of it with a sustainable system that is isolated from the broader capitalistic system? Because it's not just a community level issue, but it's also a very systemic issue, right? Everything is sort of interconnected. The regions along the border do not exist in isolation from everything around. So like, what do we do about that? Like, yeah.
That's a question for Dr. Sange, right?
Anyone who is comfortable answering.
Okay, please.
I might have something to.
Sure, ma'am. Yes.
But no, that's.
Okay, okay, so see, my proposition is always this, we have to move away from this binary. We have to literally move away from this binary of, using the term like indigenous, non-indigenous, Anthropocene, if we continue to do that, then we are again going back to the same trap of this Western hegemony, right? And in so-called indigenous, knowledge or traditional environmental knowledge, which we fascinately use as one of the, sub-disciplines in anthropology, is actually a construct of the North American university. Right? So we have to literally move away from this binaries of understanding this whole idea of the environmental crisis in terms of local versus, outsiders, or indigenous versus non-indigenous. But what I'm trying to propose is that the Western ideas or the Anthropocene as it is now doesn't have that capability of incorporating the local voices. Right? So if you want to incorporate the local voices, you need to rethink this idea of Anthropocene in a very different ways. And not again by going through the same logic of binary between Anthropocenes or local or non-locals. So that is my proposition. So I don't know whether it's workable or not is a big concern. And second questions, the one that you raised on the geologist concern about the Anthropocene. Yeah, this articles, actually is a very elaborated one, which says that the geologists actually, they look for the longer periods in the history to consider certain age or epoch as belonging to that particular epochs, right? And they are completely disagree to call Anthropocene as a kind of geological epochs, because geologists have that tendency of looking for this something called the golden spike, right? There has to be something golden spike period in the history to validate this particular geological eras as being or belonging to that particular eras. And we don't have that kind of geological, golden spike to consider Anthropocene as a geological era according to the geologist. But what this article argue at the end is that although the geologist may consider Anthropocene as a dead concept, but it is very much alive among the humanities and the social science. So how does the humanities and the social science think about Anthropocene now? It's a question that we all have to engage with. So thank you very much.
Ma'am, if some...
Yes. Well, I'd like to respond to that a little anecdotally, because the moment my son came to know that I'd been very kindly invited to address this particular seminar, his pat, a kind of interjection came in the form of almost a corrective note. It said this is a term that has been, as it were, voted out of currency. So whatever are you doing talking about the Anthropocene at all? And then I asked him to share that particular kind of report and document where the voting that Dr. Tamang referred to is detailed. And it was an overwhelming majority that voted the concept of Anthropocene out of this course. Having said that, there is that final sentence which says, well, it continues to be a viable, as it were, term in terms of how it, as it were, defines what humanity has done to the earth. So the anthropogenic component to Anthropocene is still very much, as it were, alive. So it hasn't been. That bit of the, shall we say, since we are talking about whom to put the blame on and the whole point about implication, so Anthropocene has become now an implicatory concept. But I wanted to kind of say to Professor Sange, Dr. Sange, that your talk resonated so much with me, particularly after, I'm sorry to sound like a fangirl, after I've been reading him all along, but Wild Fictions, because there's this particular essay where he talks about how, typically again in the context of forests, kind of a confrontation, an adversarial relationship is kind of set up between humans and nature, between humans and plants and animals. Don't you think, and given that you are clearly in agreement with Amitav Ghosh on this, not just Dipesh Chakraborty, don't you think that this binary of the man and the animal, or the man and, let's say, the forest, or men, women and forest, however you look at it, and it's a critique of the kind of the mind matter, man nature binary that's been exploited in the West all along. Don't you think it's being weaponized, as it were? Don't you think it's being consciously strategized so that, as it were, the inhabitants can be banished from that space, despite the fact that they can actually help in the sustainable preservation, modes of preservation of forests, rather than being inimical to it?
Do you want to respond to that, or? Okay, my final words maybe, right? So would be that. So I always, again, the same thing, that I always refrain from falling into this binary, because the very binaries that we follows actually dilutes the other history, right? And this is what I don't want to happen in the case of the Anthropocene and the environmental crisis, right? And so environmental crisis actually should not be fallen within the binary so created by the West or someone else, right? It should come up from the context-based, situated experiences-based, rather than coming from the top down. So that would be my remark. Thank you, ma'am.
As the chair, I guess I have some privilege to say the final few words, kind of a thing. I guess in this context, the discourse of development becomes very important, right? The idea of progress, development, and this discourse of development, it acts like a drug, so which is seen to be affecting everyone, including the indigenous population and the outsiders, so on and so forth. And this notion of development is so powerful that it is seen to be completely destroying everything. Whether it's dams in Arunachal Pradesh or in Sikkim, right? We had recently in October itself, we had the major landslides in Darjeeling, and 2022, I guess, the Glof in Sikkim, right? But then also, of course, we have policymakers and leaders, world leaders such as Donald Trump, who doesn't believe in climate change. He believes that climate change is a hoax, and strongly emphasizes that we will go for full fossil fuel extraction and fracking and so on and so forth. So I guess the anthropoi and the anthropogenic doesn't end. It actually becomes more stronger with this whole mantra of development. Thank you so much again. Thank you for your patience. It's exact 45 minutes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tamang, for your, regionally grounded presentation. And thanks to Dr. Lama as well for moderating this session. So I think we should breathe and then take some time and let our stomachs take the floor. So we break for lunch. We'll come back again within 30 minutes. Thank you. Please proceed towards placement cell for your lunch. Volunteers, please guide our guests.
Hello.